So welcome everybody. It's nice to see you, some of you, I think most of you again. Just a few logistical things. Please mute yourselves so that we can hear the conversation clearly without background noise. And please, I encourage you strongly to submit questions in the chat. We should have enough time. We structured the program today to leave enough time at the end for questions. So please take advantage of that. Thank you. And I think that's it for logistics. I want to thank also our sponsors for tonight, right? So of course I represent the Jewish Federation in the heart of New Jersey. Also, the Gandhi King Season for Nonviolence has partnered, as well as Monmouth Reform Temple. So it's great to have a partnership like that. So thank you all, those of you from those organizations that are on, thank you very much. Okay, so in case you weren't here for the first time, I'm just gonna briefly reiterate my opening remarks from session one. Like I said, my name is Dan. I am the manager of the Jewish Federation, the Heart of New Jersey Community Relations Council. Its mission is to work directly with ethnic, religious, and political leadership on matters in central New Jersey to advocate and raise awareness and seek practical solutions in matters important to the Jewish community. Combating hate and promoting tolerance and understanding is one of those issues. And strengthening interfaith relationships, building on open communication and shared values and goals is a very important component in the fight against anti-Semitism and all hate. And the JCRC, meaning the Jewish Community Relations Council, is working all the time to establish a network of community alliances for this reason and also for other reasons. Tonight's program is the second of this series, and it's part of the Seeing Human series that was started back in, I think, 2017. This is a series of multi-ethnic conversations aimed at stemming hate and bias and bigotry. And Jewish Federation and Rabbi Mark Klein of Monmouth Reform Temple, who is also the Jewish Federation, the Heart of New Jersey Interfaith Chair, started this series. So we're very proud to come back every year and to do programming under the title of Seeing Human. So I want to thank you all for being here tonight and hope you enjoy the conversation tonight. Without further delay, we'll begin. I'm just going to turn it over to Rabbi Klein just to introduce the panel and then we'll get going. Rabbi?
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dan. Thanks to the Federation and to the Gandhi King Season for Nonviolence. This is the 25th anniversary of Gandhi King's Association. It started with the families, the Gandhi and King families at the UN, beginning with the date of the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, January 30th, culminating on April 4th, with the date commemorating the assassination of Dr. King. And just one last thing, the culminating event is on the 4th of April. And before we're done, somewhere in the chat will be published the link so that you can participate in watching that Dr. Arun Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, who runs the Gandhi Center for Nonviolence in Rochester, will be speaking at that event with us. So that said, we've brought together people with whom I'm very close, I have known each of these and many, and they've gotten to know each other. And from the purpose of this conversation is not to water down our respective traditions, but to be able to demonstrate the many ways in which faith plays out in this world. Many very different, some of which we understand in each other, some of which we don't, some of which we agree and some we don't. And none of it impacts how we cherish each other, an element that's certainly missing from the world conversation. And so I guess where you are on my screen, Katja Gruning is the pastor at the Presbyterian Church in Shrewsbury, which is near and dear to the heart of Monmouth Reform Temple, since we were actually founded in that church building. I'd like to say it's the only time in history that Christianity gave birth to Judaism. And So then we have Joe Gratzel, Manasquan Baptist Church, and we have Janet Jones from AME Zion, Shrewsbury Avenue in Red Bank, and we see Jeffrey Roy from St. George's by the River. Samaj Van Zant, as he will say, my brother from another mother. He is at Second Baptist in Asbury Park. And with us last time, but not tonight, as Imam Mustafa Al-Amin from Masjid Ibrahim in Newark. He is very apologetic, but they've made a decision for the first time in 2 years to open the mosque for Ramadan and in person, and he is inundated with everything that goes along with that. And so at some point, some of us will be talking about our relationships with the Muslim tradition, certainly the importance of Ramadan and its place on the religious calendar and observance. And we invite questions from everybody because we really want to grow this into a community conversation. Reverend Joe Gratzel at the end will talk about some things we want to ask you to participate in moving forward, because we don't want this to be a 1, 2, 3 and done. We want this to be the creation of something that really spreads throughout the community. So with that, Dan, can I throw it back to you?
Yes, sir. Okay, so the subject for tonight, and it was on the registration page, am I more faithful because I attend worship and observe rituals? So the first question I'm going to throw out is, who determines or measures appropriate ritual practice? And is there divergence within the denominations? So I will leave it up to you. Who wants to answer?
Who wants to start? Because I can volunteer. I can volunteer somebody.
Go ahead, Mark. Voluntel.
Joe, go ahead, please.
Okay, so we are, among the traditions represented here, the least liturgical, the least ritualistic of the group. And so I'm sort of speaking on behalf of the folks on the furthest end of the spectrum, perhaps. This is what I might wear to church on a Sunday morning, for example. We don't have a liturgy per se in our worship service, although if you do the same thing every week, isn't that a liturgy? We're probably at the furthest extreme in that regard. And so for us, we have, I guess, a different set of criteria by which we would judge your faithfulness. And that has evolved, as I would imagine it has in almost all of our traditions, has evolved over time. And so there was a day when you were a good Baptist if you were at church on Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday for Bible study, and your children were at the youth group and at Sunday school and had their perfect attendance pin. And those were some of the markers. And then if you showed up dressed in an appropriate way and arrived at an appropriate time, and probably all of those things I just mentioned are out the window, at least at my church.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, so in comparison to that, in the Presbyterian version of Christianity, we have our ritual life is a little bit more structured. We have, when we get together for worship, we have a pretty structured liturgy. The exact words change from week to week, but the order is the same. And yeah, as far as sort of the expectation of attendance and things, yeah, that's a little bit of a hard one now because there's been an evolution, right? We're kind of, like Joe said, there's no expectation that you have to show up for worship, have to participate in rituals on a certain schedule. You know, we do expect with, I think, most Christian traditions that, you know, the minimum bar is show up for Sabbath worship. And if you can show up every week, that's great. But we measure regular worship attendance by like once or twice a month now. So, you know, it's there is some cultural influence there too. But yeah, and you know, we have local local control over the, what our service looks like and how we put rituals together. But when we talk a little bit more about the kind of sacraments, which are our two specific rituals that we have to do in a certain way, there we have more rules. So we'll probably snake around to that later. So I'm gonna leave that for when we get to it.
Yeah, this Samaj, I can just add that right along with what Joe already said, one of the things, especially in our context, is the designation of being a member in good standing, which simply says that you give money to the church, you are financially active in you giving to the church, and really that is faithfulness, right? That is where you continue to give, and so that we might continue to operate. And of course, along with, like Katja just said, it's we've discovered that people attend once every 6 Sundays, right? That's about you have your core group that are there as most, most of the Sundays, but for outside of that core group, people attend once every 6 Sundays, and it's heartbreaking. But then, of course, you have your CME. We call them CME Christians. Christmas, Mother's Day, and Easter, and the church is packed to the rafters, and no seats to be found. So, and yet all of them would call themselves faithful, and would be called by others to be faithful members, especially when they die. So, oh, they were so faithful. They only came 3 times a year, but they were faithful members.
Janet,
Okay.
you're muted.
Well, there are those who haven't attended worship in years, but still consider themselves faithful members. But in our tradition, there is an expectation of showing up for corporate worship. And today is whether you're in person or you call in or you're on video conferencing. And as far as our worship, our denomination has a suggested order of worship, but there's much flexibility so at a local congregation, it depends on the pastor, really, on how your order of worship will really will be and how structured it will be. And in the AME Zion Church, you could go to 10 different congregations and you will think you're in, they'll all be different in some ways. Some will be very quiet, some are going to be very animated and vocal, but the expectation and the rituals, there are rituals that we observe, the 2 that were mentioned, baptism and the Lord's Supper, but there are other rituals as well that give meaning to our gathering. Okay, so and there is divergence among denominations. There are divergences within denominations, but I kind of got lost on where our question was, but if you could bring me back, I could.
Sure. The question was, who determines appropriate ritual practice, and is there
Okay.
divergence within
All
the
right. Yes.
denominations?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the 2 that are common to Christianity is determined by someone beyond us, but anything other than those 2 are in our tradition. It happens at the local level, and I think that is a good thing because our context varies and who shows up varies. But on our local congregation, we pretty much have the same pretty much core group that shows up almost every Sunday. And there's the fringes, that's 1 or 2 Sundays a month, and others you might see once a year or whatever, but the bulk of our congregation is there every Sunday because from the beginning, we teach that it's important to gather in corporate worship.
Jeffrey, Mark, so what goes on in your, Jeffrey and Mark, what goes on in your
Well,
places of
so
worship?
in contrast to everyone so far, I am at the opposite end. The Episcopal Church, which is a member of the Anglican Communion worldwide, the Church of England, we have a book called the Book of Common Prayer. And so if you go to any Episcopal church in the United States, you're going to run into pretty much the same worship. That's not to say within, communities or contexts, there won't be some differences, but the core Sunday worship will be taken from the Book of Common Prayer and will be fairly uniform in most Episcopal churches. That's not to mean, and it doesn't mean that we are restricted, and to fully unpack or discover the richness of the Book of Common Prayer would take years and years of worship. But again, in the Episcopal Church, we have no structured, we don't say if you want to join the Episcopal Church, you have to come and sign off on these statements of belief, or here's what it means to be Episcopalian. We say, well, if you want to join the Episcopal Church, you come and you worship with us a couple of times, because how we worship is how we pray. And so I'm kind of at the other end of that spectrum. In terms of participation, I think that's a key question that most denominations are struggling with now. The conversation in my context is, does participation in online worship really count? In looking at the number of attendees on a given Sunday or a given service, does virtual participation count? And for me personally, I don't refer to it, if you participate in our online worship, I don't call it, if you're watching us online, I do refer to it as participating online, that our prayer, our faith, our worship is much bigger than anything that happens in the four walls of the church. But it is an ongoing discussion about, I think, for the future, what's it going to mean for that?
So Mark, we haven't heard the
Yeah.
Jewish perspective yet, so
Well,
we'd love to know.
the traditional Jewish answer to any question is it depends. And so we have a liturgical tradition with a fairly set liturgy. And one could argue, in fact, the prayer book that we use in Hebrew is called a Siddur, which translates as the order, meaning there's a line that you're supposed to follow. And the worship service has 3 different pieces to it. And there's a way of breaking that down. Different parts of the Jewish world will express them somewhat differently. And while whatever synagogue you walk into is going to have the basic elements of the service, different synagogues will offer them musically different. Some will offer them in length, will focus much longer on one piece or on another. And so what I can tell you is that the purpose of the worship experience is to bring people together. Worship being the thing we do publicly, even while prayer is something that we'll do privately. And so you may have a prayer book that people are reading, and everybody in the room is reading the very same words, and yet everybody in the room is understanding those words very differently than the person sitting next to them. And that's fine. And I guess the best answer to that piece of it is, if you didn't like the music that day, or if you didn't like the sermon that day, but everybody around you loved it, it was a great service, including you, because your community was blessed. If you got everything you wanted that day and no one else liked it, it might have been nice for you, but it wasn't good for the community, because that communal piece is everything. And so we have been wrestling, Jeff, is exactly what you talked about. What does it mean to participate? Certainly during COVID, participating online was the only way that you could be part of the community. We've been live streaming for 7 years already. So because we have people who are shut-ins, we have people who are far away. And I don't know that we really figured out the total value of live streaming until COVID, when that was the only access people had. Now that people can come back, I've been told a number of times, watching Yom Kippur services on my couch in my pajamas is a great experience. So I thought we could, one day have everybody come to synagogue the way you would watch it on TV, but I was afraid of what people would come wearing. So that said, there's no control that says you have to do it a certain way. And we're free, certainly in the Reform and conservative Reconstructionist movements within Judaism, to manipulate the liturgy and the worship thematically for what we need in that day, including how you translate the Hebrew into English, what music settings that you use. So there's no hierarchy that says you have to do it a certain way, and we really answer to each other and how that works out. That said, even in the Reformed Jewish tradition, there are 5 Reformed congregations in this county, and if you walk into any one of them, you may or may not recognize the service based on the last one that you were in, for the reasons of the individualistic nature of the worship. So that's what I can say. I guess one more thing, if I may, and that's just that the Hebrew versus the English, that also is a matter of congregation to congregation, which works and understandability. In the Muslim tradition, since my brother Mustafa is not here, you're supposed to pray 5 times a day. It begins with the profession of faith, the Shahada, and then you'll read the first chapter of the Quran, and there's a series of prayers, including movement, the body, intentional repositioning of the body based on the prayer cycle. It's interesting because the service traditionally doesn't last very long, and the sheikhs teach that you're supposed to spend more time working than you are praying. So while we're all going to have hour-long services, or longer in some parts of our religious world, the actual worship experience in a Muslim tradition is not a very long one, so they can get to the conversations they need to have or to the work that they need to share. And so it's what I can offer.
Thank you. So there's a wonderful conversation going on in the chat, and I think Pajama Day has a vote.
We're all in.
Looks like everybody is in agreement, no matter what denomination or religion. So I'm actually really interested in the next question, because this is something that personally I've been struggling with in the last 10, 15 years of my life. I'm very proud of my Jewish faith and tradition, but I found myself going less and less and less to synagogue to pray. So is there a distinction between public worship versus private? And I would love to hear what y'all have to say. And so I'll pick on, let's see, I'll pick on Joe. You can start.
So I think one of the questions that we probably would have to, we don't have to all go round again, but one of the questions is that what is the purpose of worship? So again, if you go to the other extreme, in the Roman Catholic tradition, one step further, if you will, liturgically than Jeff, or similar, right? The purpose of the worship service is to celebrate Eucharist, to celebrate communion. And even if nobody showed up, the priest would still celebrate communion, because that is the purpose of the gathered community. And so we kind of go backwards along that spectrum, back through Jeff and Janet and Katja, back down to me, and the Christian side of that, in terms of what is the expectation of why do we come to worship. So in the low church tradition where Samaj and I reside, the preached event is the reason you come. And so until recently, when you couldn't have that experience any place but in person, you came together to hear the word proclaimed. And that was the focus. So where other traditions might have a liturgy of the Eucharist and a liturgy of the word and different components, in the Baptist tradition, particularly, the preached event is the highlight of the worship service, which would not have been available to you in any other way but coming to where the people are.
It's interesting you say that, because in Judaism, traditionally, the only sermon ever given during the year is on Shabbat Hagadol, the Sabbath before Passover. But living in the West, we've adapted ourselves and adopted so many of the cultural traditions around us. In fact, the Reformed Jewish movement early on, because the community around us met on Sundays, we met on Sundays. It wasn't the Sabbath. It was a weekday morning service. But we wanted to be like the community. And so you had some Reformed Jewish congregations that would gather on Sundays so that the whole city would be in worship together at that time. But the sermon became a regular because of our affinity with the American tradition.
So can I ask my brothers and sisters who lead worship, how long do you usually preach for? How long are your sermons on just say a day in, day out normal worship service, Sunday or Friday, whatever your flavor is?
15 to 20 minutes.
Yeah,
I might be 20 to
or
25.
long 20.
And Pastor Samaj isn't going to answer because his number is way different than ours.
You gotta double
25
that at least.
25 to 30 minutes. he said.
In the chat, he just said 25 to 30. It depends on what's happening. And if it's a First Friday, which is an informal service, I'll tell a story that may be a couple of minutes. High Holidays this last year was about 22 to 23. Friday night can be anywhere between 10 and 20. Again, depending on what's going on and what other things are on the agenda and.
I was gonna say, I have some members of my congregation here present, and if I were to go for 20 minutes, I would have people walking, streaming out the door.
I don't know how you do it. It takes me like 2 days to write a 5-minute opening. It's crazy.
So
I prepare for about 15 and it can go anyway.
Short is harder than long, Dan.
yeah,
And there's
yeah.
no such
Yes,
thing as
agreed.
a bad short sermon.
All right, I feel
That's
better.
right.
I feel better now. Thank you.
A
But I
dear
think
friend
that-
of mine who is a minister in South Carolina, I asked him to speak. It was the first Heschel King Shabbat service that I did my first year in the rabbinate. And Ralph said, so how long do you want me to speak? And I said, well, how long do you want to speak? And because I'm brand new at this. And he said, well, if you want me to speak about 15, 20 minutes, I'll need about 6 weeks to prepare. If you want me to speak for an hour, I'm ready.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I think to Joe's point, this highlights, the focus of our worship, or the point of our worship, that those traditions where the spoken word, the preaching is the focus.
Yes.
It is a longer, and it also, I think,
Longer.
plays out in pulpits or in architecture as well, not to get too technical. But I notice in some traditions where the preaching is the focus of worship, the pulpit is right smack in the middle of
In
the worship
the middle.
space.
Yes.
For me, it is off to one side, and the altar where we celebrate the Eucharist is the focus of our architecture.
Yeah.
Yeah,
traditionally-
oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, in my tradition, if that preaching is definitely the word, you come in. Is the focus. That is really the expectation, right? You want the choir to sing, you want to see other people, but the thing that you come for the most is the preaching. And
Yes.
and there's this expectation that the preacher is going to help me understand this. And there's a appetite for no less than 20 minutes. Now I had some folk, who, just a few of them was like, oh, he preached too long. But for the most part, there's an appetite for the, 20 to 30 minute sermon, because it's engaging. There's a call and response. And so there's a lot of back and forth in it. It's almost a conversation between the preacher and the congregant. And so it becomes an event unto itself within the space of worship.
So it seems
Yeah.
like the public worship is obviously a lot more structured and planned, of course. What does private look like? You know, if you're praying privately, is it a conversation with God on your own? Are you taking from prayers that you know you usually use during your service? I'm just curious. We don't all have to answer because I do want to get to the other question, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I think private is kind of wherever the individual takes it. It could be just a time of prayer. It could be a time of just sitting quietly, nothing. Or it could be reading a devotional or listening to music or reading scripture. Private worship is really geared to the individual or the family group or whoever is having it. And it can be as a few moments or it could be longer. It depends on the person or the individual. And what's included in it is also dependent on the individual, because this has more to do with the individual need or the family need, if it's a family time of worship, as opposed to the corporate worship, where in our tradition also the focal point of worship is the preached word.
You know, in our tradition, and I would say this probably extends past our tradition in different ways, but the worship experience is the prelude to prayer. You'll say the words in the sanctuary, but if they don't manifest in something that you do after you leave, we call that a bracha levatala, a prayer without value. And so saying the words or listening to the word doesn't help you unless you then go and do something. And so prayer actually is the thing that you do, having heard it or practiced it in worship. You know, Heschel was famous for teaching things like prayer has to be subversive. It has to undercut complacency and callousness. And if you don't emerge from your prayer someone different than you started, you didn't pray. Prayer, when he was marching with Dr. King, he argued he was praying with his legs. And so, you know, the dichotomy, I guess, Dan, that you've asked is the worship experiences, the rallying of the troops, and then the prayers, how it impacts us as individuals and how we go out and live that and how it's changed our behaviors afterwards.
I want to try to tie a couple pieces together because I was thinking about this in anticipation of the conversation. Those of you who come from traditions who have a variety of more fixed rituals, for example, the clothing you wear, the times of the day you might observe, the days that, you know, more carved out activities. I think that, to me, what we're lacking in the low church tradition is we don't carve out those special times, even to the extent of those of you who might have grown up, and Janet, this was a big deal in your house on Saturday night, what mom used to do to make sure all of the girls in your household went to church with their hair, and she got out that flat iron, and, you know, and all those things that happened in your house because you had to look good when you went to church on Sunday morning, right? And even that tradition of carving out my Sunday go to meeting clothes, that many of us may have grown up with, or I grew up in a Catholic tradition where, you know, having a prayer veil, we have kind of thrown out the baby with the bathwater, I think, in that regard. So whether it's in public worship and what we do when we go to church, or how we go to church when we dress, or whether we take the time to go to our prayer closet, or as our, you know, prayer on a prayer rug, or wear a particular piece of garb at all times to signify my faith. I think I honor the fact that those who observe those rituals have carved out something to make space for that.
Yeah, I grew up with that, and even as an adult, but in recent years, at least in my tradition, a lot has changed, and I don't know if it's just because of the congregations that I've served, where I'm more interested in people coming rather than how they look when they come, or but that is changing, because we have a generation or two that did not grow up with that kind of structure in our household.
Did we lose something when we let that go? I guess that's the question I would ask.
Yeah, I think we did lose something.
And did we gain something?
Um,
Faith evolves. None of us are practicing the same religion that our grandparents practiced at our age. And somehow things continue to evolve so that faith stays relevant. Ritual music. When Danny Freelander, Jeff Klepper, and the late Debbie Friedman put guitars to the liturgy in the 60s, that was just revolutionary. My mom still hates the new music, their music, which is now the old music by 3 generations. And so, the idea of gospel rock, I love some of that music. I mean, some of it is actually on my playlist for working out. It's spiritual, it's moving, and so so we've lost some of the formality, but perhaps we've also gained some relevance. The question is, how have we demonstrated that new relevance to the people for whom it would be relevant? So we've changed what we're happening, but have we been able to share that message with the people who would want to hear it and for whom it would make religion relevant again?
Yeah, definitely. I think, to that point, I do think as far as the dress, right, and it does make worship more casual. But I think it also makes it more, it opens it up for more people to come. Because before, I know it was about, and how dressing up was about showing off the class, the socioeconomic status in which you came from. And so you would come to church and it would be distinguished by the type of clothes that you had on. And still in some way, but maybe I just feel like it's not as much, that way. But and of course, if I can just put on anything to come to worship, then I think you lose some of the expectation of something greater in this or this thought or notion of preparation, right? I'm preparing myself to go to worship, and it's different than how I dress up any other time. And so I think some of that might be lost, but I do think we've gained a whole lot more. And I would only echo Mark's point that that there's a greater sense of relevance because the world has become more casual, right? I mean, I know growing up, I was always taught you go to something that was minorly business affiliated, you had to put on a whole suit and a tie. I mean, but now people are wearing khakis. Well, now people not even going to work, but to the building. But when they were, it was you can wear khakis and a polo shirt to a professional office building, and before that wouldn't even have been a thought. And so the world has become more casual, and I do think it does help the church be more relevant. I wanted to speak also to the previous discussion where we're talking about worship. I have an expanded thought of worship too. It is not only the worship. There's public worship, and then there's private worship. And this private worship is what Reverend Jones talked about, right? Reading the scripture, meditation, those things. I also think that private worship is living out your purpose wherever you are, right? Whatever this God-ordained purpose is, that you are living out that purpose. And so when Mother Teresa was dealing with the infirm, right? That was a form of worship because she was giving God glory with her whole being. When people are helping, whether they're serving food or whether they're caring for a loved one or elderly, right? If that is what they're called to do, then to me, that's a form of worship because all of your being is involved in giving God glory in what you are doing. And so I do think that, worship goes, there's a public worship, a private worship that where we're trying to feed ourselves with God's word or God's presence, but there's also a worship of being God's presence amongst others and giving your whole self to that.
Right. Well, I'm in agreement with that. I guess for lack of better words, we might have look at when we gather for worship as a worship event, but our lives, our lifestyle ought to be worship.
There's a
And
Roman Catholic order called
right.
the Benedictines, and the
Right.
motto of the Benedictines is ora et labora, Latin for work is prayer. And so, you know, there are those of us who worship and pray with our heads. There are those of us who worship and pray with our hearts, but there are many among us who worship and pray with their hands. And I think that that's the recognition of all of that offering our entire life to God in whatever we're doing.
Yes.
So while this is a fascinating conversation, but the next question is actually even more fascinating in my opinion. So I really want to get to it, and it's the last one. I don't know if we have time for all of you to answer, so I'll ask for 2-3 volunteers so that we can have enough time for questions from anyone in the audience. So this is not controversial, but I think very it'll be very interesting to hear your opinions as leaders of faith. How does your tradition view the non-practitioner? And I'll pick on Katya this time, if I may.
Yeah, sure. So in my tradition, we practice, we try to practice a very broad welcome and inclusion of all people in worship and in our ritual life. Everyone is invited to full participation. In my particular Christian tradition, for example, in a worship service where we are celebrating Holy Communion or the Eucharist, our table is open, which means that you do not have to be a baptized Christian. You don't have to be a member of our church or our denomination to come and fully participate in that. There's differences here in the Christian denominations over who gets to come to the table. So ours is open, which is an interesting, it's it's only been open, officially our church constitution was revised that way for a handful of years. For a long time our practice was you had to be a baptized Christian, so you had to have that prerequisite to fully then participate in worship that had communion in it. And but and otherwise everything in our churches is open. Our goal is to share the good news of Jesus Christ, and that whoever is in need of good news is welcome. And we don't proselytize, and we're not very heavily evangelistic, and so we hope and we believe that that's inviting for folks, doubts and questions, and people from other faith traditions who want to visit, or folks who show up and don't know the ritual. The big question for us and folks unfamiliar is, how do we do the rituals and traditions valuable to us, and also make those accessible to people who show up and are like, I don't know when to sit, and I don't know when to stand, and I don't know what to wear, and why are people moving around, and do I need to do that? Yeah, that's where we're gonna start.
Yeah, I think some of us have addressed this a little bit already. I'm not sure what a non-practitioner is, because you may not show up on a regular basis, but you're absolutely supportive of the mission. The people who show up on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, I'm never going to say to them, it's finally good to see you once a year, because people show up in all sorts of ways. And certainly during the pandemic, when nobody was there, and yet the mission of our congregation continued to grow, we know that people, whether it's financially or with time or with energy, give a lot of, and so I'm not sure how to define that, but there's a host of ways in which we look at who can do what. There is a tradition in some parts of the Jewish world that you have to be Jewish to say the blessing over the Torah reading. Although Israel in the Torah is not Judah, which is Judah's 1/12 of all of Israel. And so there's a whole part of the Jewish world that would argue that if you are a person of faith, because that's literally what the text would say. Even Maimonides argued that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are similar monotheistic faiths. So so how we see who can participate in honors or in leadership, that's going to vary community to community. And I think that that's really a crux, is none of us want to say that someone is out. At the same time, we don't want to be dishonest as to who we are. But if I may, I'd like to throw out a question that's sort of related to this in terms of beliefs. And I think, Joe, you actually posed it, earlier on. When we talk about why we gather, it's not just about the community, but what's the theology or the ethos behind gathering. And so, Saturday is the Sabbath according to the Western religious traditions. Sunday is the holy day because that's the day of resurrection. For some parts, well, for Islam, Friday is when they celebrate as Jummah, and that's their holy day. So we got the whole weekend covered. And if you're Seventh-day Adventist, you're going to do a piece of all three of those. And so, is it the Lord's Day? Is it the Sabbath? Some people will call Sunday the Sabbath. It's, how do we talk about the why we gather when we gather?
So I think we should be honest as Christians and say we are not Sabbatarians. We don't observe Sabbath. We observe Lord's Day because that's so central. Resurrection is the essential moment of the Christian faith. Without the resurrection, there is no Christian faith. So for us, the centrality of resurrection is honored by Sunday. And so it would be unfair for us to call ourselves Sabbatarians because we know God, seventh day was the day God rested. We don't try to change God's calendar. Sabbath is Saturday. We just don't observe it.
Rebirth, I guess, versus finishing creation is the whole concept of rebirth and regeneration in faith, is the way I was taught in Christian tradition. Anybody?
So Mark, maybe we can move on to the questions because we don't have that much time left. And there aren't any questions in the chat, but I have a feeling people have questions and maybe they're a little shy. So come on, somebody jump in.
Hello.
Yes,
Susan Wyman?
Susan Wyman. Yes.
I have a comment. I feel like I have prayed both privately and publicly during this past hour because my body feels so relaxed. And I think that the divisions that mark our partisan world right now are so intense that it's not until we have a chance to do something like we did just now that makes us feel whole again. So I am just relating the private and public worship that I felt I prayed privately, but I also prayed with all of you in community. So I felt it was a very satisfying hour that we just spent.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you for that. That was great. That was wonderful. Anyone?
Nothing else. I want to throw out something provocative that Samaj and I were debating earlier.
Go for it.
We talk about our religious traditions and we think about them in terms of tradition and liberal or neo. And I think sometimes we ignore, that Moses was a liberal and Jesus was a liberal and Muhammad was a liberal because they fought to change the system that was, or were seen to be changing the system that was for some evolved greater sense of prayer. And I don't mean political, although it plays out certainly that way, but anybody, so Joe, you just post, let's have it.
So I would say that Jesus was a radical conservative, that he said he came to fulfill the law, not to overthrow it, and that he was calling out the misinterpretation of the Pharisees of his day of the law. And so he was actually more of a more. Fundamentalist is such a negative word in today's world, but he was more calling people back to fundamentals, and I would say that was a hallmark of a radical conservative more than a liberal, who I see as someone who's more antinomian.
Just for the record, it says Pharisees, but that was the remnant. I mean, everything that he railed against was actually Sadduceic. It was about the corruption of the temple. He was a Pharisee. And so, I guess part of how we read scripture even, and how we understand history determines where we are on some of this stuff.
Yes.
And Samaj, brother, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I would, these terms are, whenever you have conversations with liberal and conservative, right, you have to almost start with, how do we define it? And and so if I just using your term, Mark, talking about Jesus being a liberal, right? I would have to define, for me, liberal is that liberal is being open to change, right? And conservative would be more preserving of tradition. And so I would have to say then that Jesus was both. I mean, we may call him moderate, but I think that there were places, right? There's conservative nature of preserving the tradition that that God is, of who God is, and our relationship to God and things. But there's also a liberal side of Jesus Christ where the tradition was rigid, that he was willing to stretch it and to be open and to welcome people who before would not have been welcome, or to elevate the value of women, and to just Jesus was open to those things that maybe that tradition in many ways was, or people who were holding tight to tradition were not. So I wouldn't be able to say that Jesus is a liberal or conservative, but I would have to say that Jesus was both, and he did it well.
Moses brought a new twist to it, the idea of arguing with God as opposed to being blindly obedient. Muhammad brought a whole new understanding with the revelation of Quran. I guess part of the conundrum is that a lot of the people who profess one absolute or the other believe that they're either holding on to something, even if they've changed it wholesale, but that's how they see it's supposed to be, or in changing it wholesale, whatever. The point is that they see what they see, the myopia of how they view religion, and then they label that as the correct way. In the term Orthodox in Judaism, that means the right way. Orthodox means the right way. Well, the Orthodox tradition is a response to the Jewish Reformation. So there was no Orthodox Judaism, there was Judaism. And then the reformers left the shtetl, and all of a sudden people say, no, you can't do that. You have to keep it this way, and this is the right way of doing it. But if you go to the Talmud, we're supposed to be living amongst the nations and not in a shtetl. So the question is, who's calling it the radical or the conservative, and who's calling it the liberal?
Yeah, and can I also put into this conversation that none of us are all one thing or the other, right? That all of us have this, we're living this both in reality. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice to try to categorize somebody or people into different categories because all of us are, are the sum total of a whole lot of things, and we probably have more in common than we don't. And I think we really miss out on that. I think we really miss out on the richness of each other and the unity that can be present, because we're trying to see which category you fit into, when really we just have to realize that none of us are all of anything. We are a combination of a whole lot of things.
Jeff Prakash, you want to weigh in? I know we have a question in the chat, but do either of you guys want to weigh in?
I think that wherever you would connect the word prophetic is where I would put Jesus, because I think that what he did is he picked up the tradition of the prophets to call whatever was not right, in society and the way people were living together in community and their relationship with God. Wherever it was not right, he was trying to set that right by teaching and by example and yeah, I'm not sure that you can, I'm not sure that liberal and conservative, I'm not sure those words really characterize that properly. You can have prophets and.
Well, there is a line of thinking that says Jesus was a thug. So, and that, he turns things out. He'll flip your tables if you mess with him, or he turns things
There is a
upside
book,
down.
Jesus in Bad Company. It's out of print now, but there is a book, Jesus in Bad Company.
So
It's an
on
interesting
that
read.
note,
But we have a question. Amy?
Do we have a question? Because
Yes, we
I
do.
want to be mindful of people's. I don't see it.
Amy, go ahead.
Oh, Aby, go ahead.
I could save it for another time if that's better.
Well, go ahead, because it's for Joe, and Joe's closing out anyway. So
okay.
we'll answer the question briefly and then close us out.
It was just an interesting thing because Joe, when you were talking about the Sabbath, Saturday versus Sunday, the Sabbath versus the Lord's Day, so it sounded in your voice like there was something that maybe was being given up, that God said to keep the Sabbath, but we're not doing that. We're keeping the Lord's Day. But I was just wondering, for Christians, are you giving up anything? Because I thought Christians don't hold themselves to have to keep the law, only the spirit of the law. And so are you really giving up anything?
So I would say, again, that has certainly evolved over our lifetime. I grew up in Bergen County. Paramus is the only town left in New Jersey, I think, that still has blue laws. And so even the notion of what you could do on a Sunday afternoon and what you couldn't do, and what you could eat and what you couldn't eat, and those sorts of rules. But I think that all of those things, and I really don't think that for many Christians in America today, the notion of any kind of sacrifice in order to practice their faith is somewhat distasteful, if not abhorrent. The notion that they would have to give up their chance to go see the Giants in order to go to church is just ridiculous. The notion that they should not go to their son's football game, which why on earth is it scheduled on Sunday morning, but they're going, like that whole notion of giving anything up, I honor it. I think it's important. But I don't think that it continues in Christian tradition in America in 2022.
Cool.
Thanks, Joe. So, Joe, I'm going to hand it back to you because you wanted to close us out and talk about next steps and so on. And then I'll just mention something at the end, and then we can say goodnight.
So since I'm the obvious big mouth in the group, they appointed me. Oh, well, Mark and I share that distinction, but
love you, brother.
But they appointed me to just kind of say at the end what we're hoping, and there are a lot of things that we would hope come out of this, and there'll be further dialogue and opportunities for people to join. And Dan has a good email list now from all of you. But we also want to find ways to bring not just this group, but to use the leverage of our relationships with the people in our congregations to bring people together face to face. Because whatever goals we might have in terms of things we could do together to speak in a unified voice as people of faith and goodwill will only spring out of relationship. If we were to call all of us together just because we're such a nice bunch of people, I'm not sure that we would speak as loudly or as clearly if we came together out of a sense of relationship. And so I'm building relationship with some of the panelists. I already had a relationship with others, but if we were to speak together as a panel, we would be speaking out of the heart of our relationship with each other. And we want to find ways to invite not just you, but ideally your sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters to also join us in this conversation in some in-person opportunities. They may be informal, they may be fun, they may be activities, but to bring a broader cross-section of people together who don't practice what you practice or look how you look or speak how you speak, and get to know each other so that we can speak together as people of faith and goodwill out of a voice of relationship.
Thank you, Joe. And we'll be in touch about that. And also, I would love to remind you all that part 3 is scheduled for April 21st. The title is Ordained in the Music Hall, Does It Matter Where I Pray? So we'd love to see all of you back then.
Joe,
And
Dan, can you
and more.
post the link to the Gandhi King event?
I
please?
believe it's posted now.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Ah.
see it in the chat. It's there.
Thank you.
So yeah, I encourage you all to check out also the April 4th event and the Gandhi King, and would love to see you all back next month and bring friends. This was a great discussion. Thank you all. I thank the panelists and thank you all for showing up, and have a great night.